This is a Photoshop file I've created for the next set of textures. It's really quite simple. What I've got are just some variations of lines and outlines. What I'm going to do is create some framework just to vary the textures on the buildings with it. So I created this as a single file with a bunch of different layers, depending on which version of Photoshop you're using, if you have access to Photoshop. Of course, you could create this in Cinema very easily, the same way that the windows were created. But if you do have access to Photoshop and you have a file like this and you need to set it up where every single layer is going to be a file, there is an option under Scripts to export layers files. So what you can do is choose the initial name for the file and then run that, and it'll save every single layer as a file. So this is what I have. I just called it frame. It'll also add after the sequence number the name of the layer. So what I did was went in and just edited that out. That's also a command you could do in the Adobe Bridge, the file renamer, the batch file renamer, which is really useful. We'll also create a frame 0, which I did remove and renamed as 10. So I'm going to use these in order to modify some frame structures. I made just a few changes to the city. Created a couple of different buildings, some new variations, and added them to the list. And then changed the window tiling texture size to 7.5 for the X and 7 on the Y. So just a few changes. What I'm going to do is pull up the materials, and we're going to create a new material. Now, we may have to make a few modifications to the texture. Well, not so much the texture. The way that the buildings are created stepwise. If you're going to be setting up your windows and things using the fixed floor size, which is really useful in a lot of cases. For what I'm about to do right now, it might not be the best way to achieve the look I want, and we might have to switch over the initial step size to 1 and vary it so that it's just one large extrusion for every single building. So we'll have to see. Just because it does have a lot of extrusions, and I really just wanted to show that in case you needed to have a fixed amount for a floor size. If you're going to be creating something, from a set of plans or anything like that, and, that can be really important. Or if you have tons of texture maps that are set up, maybe for that type of method, where you need that max UV, that is really useful, just because it is difficult to create those selection tags when you're working with a dynamic extrusion like this. So I just wanted to show that option is available. And it is still useful for some other techniques I would like to show if we have time. But what I'm going to do now is just drag in that frame and create a new material. We're going to call it framework. This is going to go over the windows, and we could even have it go over the top if needed. So I'm going to start with selecting this texture. Just to right click, copy it, go over to the framework material. We're going to open up the material editor, and go over to the alpha, turn that on, switch, go to MoGraph, and add in the multi-shader. Turn off the soft, invert it, possibly. May need to invert that back, we'll see. And then I'm going to paste that. Go to frame, under animation, calculate it. You may not need to calculate it, I just found that it does tend to read things better. Sometimes it doesn't work though, it really depends. So it does look like I am going to need to turn off that invert. And right now, I'm going to stick with the basic color that I have just so I can see what's going on when I add this. So we can just minimize the material editor right now. And if you're unaware of how to collapse panels, it is Control and left click to collapse a panel. Okay, so I'm going to add the framework. Just move it below the top for now. And as you can see, it is going to fit to, of course, the UV, which is going to be a max UV per floor size, which might be a little too much. We'll go ahead and just take a look at a render. And that might actually end up working okay. It does seem to space itself out pretty well. If you don't want so many horizontal sections, you can go to the Y tile and just put it down to 0.5. Which will show only half. So that does space it out a bit more. It does modify the scale a little. It's really going to be dependent on how you want it to look. We could also set an offset to 25%. So that with the reduced scaling will fill things in a lot. Because we're using the endpoint. So you can kind of shift that around and really vary and customize the buildings a bit more. We could offset it by 50. And that does work a little better for some of the lights. But it's really just a small shift. We could reduce it even further. But keeping in mind that it is going to scale to an edge and not to the center. So if I was to type 0.2, I do believe this will probably fill most of the area. Yeah, we have much larger sections now being stretched out. So I think I'm going to just set the tiling to 1 and kind of stick with that. It looks pretty good overall, I think. Lots of variation throughout. So now I want to set up a color for the framework. So right now it's just a default color. So I'm going to make this a little yellowish and make it a little bit darker. Go over to the diffusion and we can bring that down a little bit. Go to the specular, increase the width, and decrease the height a little. And if you want to add a bit of reflection to this too, that can also make it pretty cool looking. Bring the reflection down to maybe 18. Going to go ahead and add just an infinite light to the scene for the moment. And we'll set the rotation of the light to -45 for the pitch, and let's go ahead and rotate this around to -45 on the heading. And now I want to set up a variable color on the building texture. With right now is just a single color. So what we can do is add in a multi-shader for this if we want to set up different colors. If you want to use the color that is modifying the texture, which we currently have set to the color brightness mode that's mixing all of the windows and the different frames, there is an individual color setup for that. So if you add the MoGraph color shader, it'll draw directly from that. And this is what the internal color looks like right now, with the way it's being blended from the random effector. If we take a look at the cloner object and the transform, we basically just have the initial color, and then if we go to what is affecting this, which is the Windows random, the color mode, the blending is just set right now to default. So depending on how this is chosen to modify that color, it'll change around, in this case, everything. All of our settings for the windows and also this internal color. So if we take a look at, actually we'll go ahead and do the multiply option. We now have darker colors and also a different distribution of all of the shader materials that are linked up. So each one will give a different look. And you can really kind of play around with it if you want to use that mode. Otherwise, you can set up just like we did for the distribution of the individual images using the multi-shader, which we could mix with the color shader and another color very easily, or set up a fusion between them. So actually, let's go ahead and copy this and change this over to Fusion. Paste the color shader. Set up a blend channel of a color. We'll change that color to more of a gray. And we'll go ahead and set this to an exclusion. I might want to swap these channels. We'll have to see how that's going to turn out. I think still a little too intense on the colors. We could just set it to normal mode and overlay that other color. Also, if you have a list of textures you'd like to use, you could load those into a list. Or we could just set up a very basic distribution or procedural. So now I just have a very subtle hint of color coming through. And then what I can do is go over to the diffusion channel, set up the colorizer or the color shader, and just set up more of a minimal effect for it, just to adjust the brightness in the material or the individual buildings, lighten them, darken them, and add more variation that way. We could do that with the framework as well, setting up diffusion. Also, if you want to remove the top material and have the rest of the surface show through on the top and not have anything set differently, you can see that showing. Also, that framework will show up because it is overlaid on top. So we could also set it up to have more of a transparent, darker material to modify it or mix them. So going back to the top, setting the selection, mix textures. That way we still get the best of both materials. Might be a little light. So we need to go to top, and we can darken that. If you don't want to have a direct mix and you just want to have kind of an alpha, then the best thing to do is turn off the mix textures, go to the material editor for the top surface, turn on the alpha, and set it up for a color, and set the color to the transparency amount. And then that will just overlay that material on top of it, so you could lighten it or darken it, and then adjust the alpha color to change the overall transparency. Or if you do want to have a separate set of materials for that, you could also set that up. Now, if you want to have daylighting on the surface, right now the buildings are really very dark. So if we need to, we can increase the diffusion, affecting the brightness and setting the texture to add to that 80% brightness. Maybe we'll bring it down just a little. That's going to really lighten that up. The windows, we're not going to want the loom channel turned on anymore. So what we can do is just turn that off. And for the color, well, we don't want to have the lights with that much influence for a daytime scene. Maybe once it starts to get a little darker. But otherwise, what we can do is kind of bring this over to sort of a lighter blue color for the primary color, and then take the mix strength and we can bring it down to like say 3. So let's render that out and we can take a look. So still the buildings are pretty dark overall, so I can just increase the color, brighten it up a little bit, go into the diffusion, brighten it up, maybe increase the specular lighting. A lot of different ways to customize it depending on the shot that you want. I'm going to go ahead and just add in a sky object from the Advanced Renderer module. If you don't have the Advanced Renderer module, you can add in the normal sky object and then apply a gradient to create a sky. And we can turn off that other light or just delete it. And a cool thing about the sky is we can rotate the heading without needing to modify the sun direction, which is controlled by the time and location settings. And right now I believe the shadows are going to be set to the area. And I'm going to go ahead and add in just a floor object for the ground, and just turn on the diffusion and darken it up a bit so we've got just kind of a darker ground. And just take a look at a render. So it's starting to look a little better for more daytime. It's still, the buildings are way too dark. Probably turning on a little bit of reflection for them would help. So I'm just going to go to the buildings and turn on reflection. Maybe use 20%. Go back to the framework and turn that up a little higher. That'll look nice with a higher reflection. And the windows can also have a bit of reflection as well. We don't need to really have a specific shader set up for it because the alpha is cutting out pretty much everything. So we can just turn on reflection and we'll set that up. If we want any variance in the shapes of the windows and the contours or anything like that, we would need to turn on bump mapping. But we're going to go ahead and keep it just kind of flat right now. So that definitely looks better. Of course, a little bit of diffusion or bump would really improve the look of the surface. And at the moment, the framework really isn't separating itself from the main building. It's probably way too much reflection on the main building. So we'll go ahead and grab the building texture, take the reflection, really bring that down. Go to the framework, increase it, and then I'm also going to go ahead and turn on global illumination. Just very low settings to begin with. And go back to a different camera. So this is a render with the global illumination. Looks a little better. The framework really needs something to enhance its definition, because right now it's really flat. We could create a bump map that is going to match the outer edges in order to displace it a little bit. That will certainly make it look better. We could set up a different type of diffusion. There's a lot of different ways we could really modify that. But it's definitely looking pretty interesting. I am going to go to the framework and reduce the reflection. It is a little high. Just kind of wanted to see how it would look. I'm going to go over to the sky object and turn off the area shadows. Just switch it over to a ray trace. Area shadows take a while to render. They look great, but they do take a little longer to render. Right now I just want to get something out pretty quickly. Another option you have with the advanced renderer is setting up subpolygon displacement. So what we can do is use the texture placement to modify the shapes of the buildings. We'll start with the framework. And because the alpha is really controlling the shape and really what we need, we can just turn on displacement, change it to a color, so we're just displacing outward. We'll go ahead and set our height to 2 meters, turn on subpolygon displacement, and then we are going to need to divide the mesh, possibly up to a number of 8 if we are going to also apply this to the windows to add a little bit of extra detail. But it's all really going to depend on how close we get to the object. So let's go ahead and start with a value of 4 and take a look and see if that's going to give us enough geometry. One nice thing about the way the displacement is set up is it will divide the entire object, so that if we did apply another displacement on other materials, the object is going to be divided already. So if you increase it higher than let's say 4 on another material, it will automatically increase the resolution of the other textures. So your highest number is the number that's going to be used on the object. Displacement might be a little bit high right now. I am going to, for the moment, turn off global illumination, just so we can get a faster idea of how this is going to look, just to know if we even have our scale set correctly. So it does look like that it's being extruded a little bit too much, although it does look pretty interesting. I am going to go ahead and stop this, but I did want to show just a little bit more of what this looks like rendered with this higher height, because it is kind of interesting looking. It definitely could be usable in certain situations. I'm going to go ahead and stop it. So I want the height to be probably 0.5, and then I'm going to turn off keep original edges, turn on map resulting geometry. Might need to turn off the best distribution. We'll have to see how it's going to work around the edges and whether or not we really want it to be rounded in the way it is showing up. And this does look a little bit better, but we would need a much higher sub-polygon level in order to get this to be working the way I would want it to look. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the framework, I'm going to turn off the best distribution, turn on keep original edges, set the height to 0.3, and hopefully it should look a little better. And this does look better, but for the most part it really just doesn't have enough geometry to subdivide it correctly. So we'd probably have to raise the number to probably around 6 in order to get a crisp edge around the object. Either that or really reduce the Phong angle even lower. But you can see what you can do with it. It's a pretty powerful way to add a lot of definition to the object without needing to actually go in and create the geometry. So I'm just going to turn this off, and I want to show you another thing you can do. Right now we have the framework showing up on every single object. If I wanted to just have it show up on a selection, we can basically add kind of a null shader, the same way we are controlling which materials go where. Just going into that framework material and under alpha, and right now the white areas are what's being cut off. So we can go to the multi-shader, we can add another shader, set it to a color, and white is the default. So that's really all we need to do. And now we're going to have some buildings that will not have that framework on it. So we can see this building up front here, no framework, and various ones around the scene. Not really showing that framework, although it is at the moment blending in very well with the other color, because there really just is no definition, there's no bump. So a quick solution for this without having to create any additional images, is to go to the alpha, copy the multi-shader, go to the bump and paste it in, and set up a blur offset let's go ahead and set this to 75 just to see how it's going to look. And it does add a little more highlight. If I zoom in, we can see there is definitely a change, just it's not very intense. So I think I probably need to go into the individual textures and set their blur offset. And it looks like that is what I need to do. For a still, you're going to want to change the sampling mode to an alias or sat, because it's going to be a lot crisper, look a lot better than MIP mapping, but you'll want to probably stick with a MIP for any sort of animation. And it does look like, because I did use the copy-paste method from grabbing from the alpha, they probably are connected, and it looks like all of the blur offsets are going to be the same now for the alpha. So I'm going to need to perform the same setup so that they're not linked, basically redoing it, creating a new set of shaders for the multi-shader, so we can reset that to default. Might be able to just copy the texture, go to the bump, and set up the multi-shader, and then paste in the texture. Go to animation, calculate, turn it back to layers, and then we also need to add that additional layer, which would be the white, or just the individual color. So hopefully we can set these independently. I'm going to change the blur offset on the top one, and if we go over to the alpha, it does look like did it on the wrong texture. So we're going to copy. We should be able to copy this one. Go over to the framework, go to the bump, paste it, and it does look like the sampling is different. So going back and setting the blur offset to 25, and now these are independent from the alpha, so that way we can create a bump. Otherwise, what you'd have to do is you can create a separate set of images that are blurred, just running a blur filter, depending on what your render times turn out to be. Just because this method and the blur offset can take a little bit longer to render. But we can already start to see the bump showing up. And if it is going in the wrong direction, we can just reverse the bump to go in the negative. So I do think I need to reverse the bump. And I did like earlier when the framework was applied to everything. But of course, having the option to set up that additional blank shader to be basically a null is pretty nice, and just wanted to make sure that you did know how to do that in case you ever need to apply that operation. So I am going to remove the blank shader and that null shader number 11 from both. Go to the bump, and I'm going to set a negative 200. bump value. And now we have a really nice extruded edge, and a huge difference between just that flat version that we had before. So I also want to make a few changes. We can go to the specular. If you want to switch it over to the metallic mode, you can. I'm just going to increase the height of this and the width. And then go to the reflection, maybe set it a little bit higher. Decrease the diffusion. The more you increase reflection, it's better to decrease the diffusion amount, unless you're controlling the reflection with the diffusion. I'm also going to go over to the windows, and under the luminance, I'm going to turn that on and set it to a very low value, maybe 10, making sure that the top setting of brightness is set to 0. And if you need to bring back the color, you can. But I just want a little hint, since the scene is a little bit darker, even though the sun is up very high. But it could be a slightly overcast day, although the shadows wouldn't show up so intensely. But this way we start to get a little bit of light color into it. And you could just kind of tweak that. And if you did want to go to night lighting, we can make the sunset, changing the time within the sky editor, and then bring back that full luminance channel. So there we have our little city. And I don't have a lot of the top extrusions and bevels added to all of the objects. So as I showed earlier, you can select everything from the topper, null, down, copy, paste it, add it to other objects. You can modify the extrusion settings, set up multiple effectors, a lot of different ways to randomize and create buildings, and create some pretty neat cities very easily. And this would work really well for a distant city at the moment.